When we think about the Inquisition, we think of something ancient that we have left behind. A dark organization of monks trying to root out heresy, something we'd never see today. And of course, the Inquisition is gone, right? Is it? Well, as you'll see in the second part of this video, it is and it's not. It changed, it morphed, but it's still with us today. So, in order to understand what the Inquisition was and what the Inquisition is, today we'll go through its entire history. Its different forms, what it was, what it wasn't, what it tried to do, and what it did. So let's buckle up and enter again into the catacombs of the darkest corners of European history. The medieval church claimed to be the sole guardian of salvation, but by the 12th century, that authority was under siege. While the popes until then were put often under siege by armies, they were now under siege by ideas. Heresies like Catharism spread across southern France and northern Italy, teaching doctrines that undermined the church's sacramental system, its hierarchy, and even the moral legitimacy of its wealth. It was a proto-Protestant Reformation. To the papacy, this wasn't just dissent, it was insurrection, and in 1184, Pope Lucius III issued Ad Abolendam, a turning point in Christian history. The bill instructed bishops to root out heresy through investigation and to cooperate with secular rulers in punishing the guilty. It didn't establish an organization, an Inquisition yet, but it laid the foundation. Heresy was now a criminal offense, not just a spiritual error, and would be rooted out using police methods. The growing urgency of the threat led to stronger action quickly. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX created a permanent system of inquisitorial courts through the bull Excommunicamus. The church would no longer rely on reluctant or compromised bishops, it would dispatch its own agents. This was the birth of the medieval Inquisition. Now, why was this necessary? To us, bishops, especially medieval bishops, can seem very far away. They look regal in paintings and inscriptions, but in reality they had a very deep relationship with the population, especially in low population areas where heresy could take root easier, meaning they were friends with the people around them. They knew them. They were cousins. They were brothers. Sometimes they were lovers. We are, after all, in pre-Counter-Reformation Catholicism, where lots of bishops and priests were marrying silently. And so in order to do the job, an organization was required, something colder, something sharper. The chosen agents were Dominican friars, members of a newly formed order committed to preaching and doctrinal precision. Unlike bishops, who were tied to local power structures, Dominicans were mobile, highly educated, and above all, loyal to the papacy. The mandate was simple: identify heretics, extract confessions, and preserve the purity of the faith at any cost. What emerged was a legal and bureaucratic system unlike anything seen in the medieval world. The Inquisition developed its own procedures. Anonymous denunciations were encouraged. The accused had no right to know their accusers, and the defense lawyers were rare. Heretics were presumed guilty unless they could prove otherwise. Remember, this was a moral trial, meaning to be a lawyer for someone could be dangerous in itself. After all, who would be a lawyer for a heretic other than a heretic? The use of torture was introduced in inquisitorial procedures in 1252, authorized by Pope Innocent IV through the bull Ad Extirpanda. The use of torture was limited in theory. It could not draw blood or endanger life, but it was used extensively. The goal was repentance, not information in itself. A confession was seen as both proof of guilt and a step towards salvation. Sentences varied. The truly penitent might be forced to wear a yellow cross on their clothing. undertake pilgrimages, or suffer public flagellation. But the unrepentant, or the relapsed, were handed over to secular authorities. These powers, not bound by laws of mercy, as the Catholic Church would say at the time, would execute the sentence, usually burning. The burnings in themselves were public ceremonies where the penance was performed, judgments announced, and sentences carried out. They served a dual purpose: spiritual purification and political warning. They were public, as we said, and well, we had a whole video about public punishment and how it was a spectacle, and this was no exception. It was both entertainment and spiritual theater. Inquisitors operated with wide discretion. In cities like Toulouse or Carcassonne, they interrogated entire neighborhoods, as we'll see later in the Spanish Inquisition. Confessions were often extracted by threats, leading to a ripple effect. One named would yield 5 more. Families were shattered. Entire villages were condemned. Inquisitorial records reveal chilling efficiency. Pages upon pages of confessions, recantations, and property seizures. Now, let's stop for a second. We will see that the Inquisition had many forms, and some were as deadly as we're saying, but some were not, so let's not cast a wide judgment yet. But what I want to focus on is the record keeping. The Inquisition, while of course a dark corner of European history, has its perks for a historian or a history enthusiast. They were one of the best record keepers ever. Most of our history of the family, medieval times, of how people lived, what they believed, anything, even divorce, can only be studied because of inquisitorial records. Every trial was recorded, every testimony recorded, and inquisitorial archives were protected as much as possible. Some burned down, some were lost, but we have an ungodly amount of the records at our disposal today. Now, not everyone complied with the Inquisition. In 1234, the people of Narbonne rose in open revolt against the inquisitors. In 1242, in the town of Avignonet, a group of Cathar sympathizers murdered 2 Dominican inquisitors in their sleep. But these were isolated rebellions. The system endured and grew. By the time of the 13th century, the Inquisition had become more than an emergency measure. It was a standing arm of papal governance, and it was beginning to professionalize. Here we get to a key character in the inquisitorial evolution. An Italian author, Valerio Evangelisti, even wrote a series of adventure books about him. Sherlock Holmes in medieval times, we could say. I'm talking about Nicholas Eymerich, born around 1320 in Girona, Catalonia. Joined the Dominican order early and rose quickly. In 1357, he became Inquisitor General of the Crown of Aragon. But what distinguished him wasn't his brutality, it was his intellect. Eymerich wasn't content to practice Inquisition, he wanted to perfect the organization, to make it better. His most enduring legacy is the Directorium Inquisitorium, written around 1376, a cold, meticulous manual for inquisitors that would become the standard reference for centuries. It is both a legal guide and a philosophical treatise, a window into the logic of institutional persecution, and honestly, if you want to understand medieval mentality, I would suggest you take a look at this one. Eymerich wrote this book as a methodical response to the growing complexity of heretical movements and the increasing resistance to inquisitorial power. He also wrote defensively. Eymerich had been temporarily exiled from his post after political pushback in Aragon. The Directorium was his intellectual comeback, a way to reassert control over the machinery of faith. The structure of the manual is striking. Eymerich opens by listing types of heresies, organized with scholastic precision: Manichaeism, sorcery, Judaism, Islam, apostasy, superstition, For each, he provides signs, typical behaviors, and recommended lines of questioning. He is particularly obsessed with ambiguous answers. He warns inquisitors to press further when a suspect gives unclear or overly theological responses, seeing such language as signs of cunning heresy. A heretic, he believed, is often a wolf in theologian clothing. The Directorium also gives direct instruction of the use of torture. Emmerich defends it openly, justifying its use by quoting church fathers and Roman law. He insists that repeated questioning under torture is acceptable so long as new evidence or fresh suspicion arises, a loophole that effectively allows unlimited sessions. He even suggests that specific techniques should be used: deprivation, psychological pressure, controlled physical pain. All of it, he claims, for the good of the heretic soul. It is a moral good to inflict pain. If you think we have reached the most merciless point of the Directorium, you are wrong. Emmerich encourages inquisitors to question minors and use them against their parents if necessary. He also promotes confiscation of property, not merely as punishment, but as a deterrent and financial engine for the Inquisition itself. Emmerich is thinking logistically. He wants the procedures to continue, and to do so, they need money. So, heretics become resources to be harvested, making the Inquisition a self-sustaining machine. Emmerich's recommendations shaped inquisitorial practice across Spain, Italy, and beyond. Later inquisitors, especially those in the Spanish Inquisition, would cite his work extensively. The book was reprinted well into the 16th century and can be found today. And yet Emmerich never saw himself as an innovator. He claimed to be defending orthodoxy, tradition. He saw his work as a holy one. After all, in his own words, he who does not correct the sinner shares in his damnation. But Emmerich did more than correct. He turned the Inquisition from a reactive tool into a predictive machine, one that could identify, isolate, and destroy heresy before it spread. And it worked. The last Cathars were gone, the Valdesians driven underground. But Emmerich's greatest gift to the Church was not in dealing with the past, it was in arming it for the next phase of religious control. One that would fuse Church and State in a single weapon. One that would burn through Spain. The Spanish Inquisition was born not in Rome, but in the court of the Catholic monarchs. In 1478, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile secured a papal bull from Sixtus IV, allowing them to establish an independent Inquisition, one not under papal control, but answerable to the crown. This marked a turning point. The Inquisition was no longer merely a spiritual tribunal, it became a national tool of statecraft. Now, why was this tool necessary? The answer came soon. In 1492, Spanish Catholic monarchs issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews who refused to convert. But long before that edict, Spain had already become a furnace of suspicions. Tens of thousands of Jews had converted to Christianity during the violent persecutions of 1391. Now, to understand this, we have to look at the history of Spain. Spain wasn't Catholic a few centuries before. It had been reconquered through the Reconquista. Not only that, but it was one of the main targets of the diaspora of the Jews. So, you had a lot of Jewish people, you had a lot of Muslim people, and a majority of Catholics who held power. In situations like the persecutions of 1391, people would convert, becoming conversos. That was the term that was used. It's a term colored with suspicion. You were converted, you were Christians, you were Catholics, but were you? Or were you still practicing your own religion, your own rituals, in the privacy of your home? Many conversos continued, in fact, to practice Jewish customs or Muslim customs in secret. They would light Sabbath candles on Friday night. They would avoid pork. In the Jewish community, they were called, or so-called, crypto-Jews, and they became the prime target of the Inquisition during its first century. By the late 15th century, a new obsession about conversos had emerged. Limpieza de sangre. I'm sorry for the pronunciation. It means purity of blood. It wasn't enough to be a Christian, you had to be descended from old Christians, free of Jewish or Muslim ancestry. Thus began a racialized heresy hunt, one that condemned people not for their faith, but for their family ties. The Inquisition was not the first to enforce this idea, but it gave it bureaucratic life. Tribunals investigated the family trees of suspects. Testimonies and denunciations could hinge on whether someone's grandmother had once baked matzah in secret or had spoken Hebrew prayers while dying. And the consequences were brutal. In 1485, the Inquisitor Pedro Arbues was assassinated in Zaragoza, allegedly by converso conspirators. His murder triggered a wave of arrests and executions, reinforcing the view that conversos were a fifth column within the church. The incident helped solidify its support for the emerging Inquisition. Under Tomás de Torquemada, a converso by ancestry himself, thousands were tried for being in any way related to Judaism. Sentences ranged from public humiliation and confiscation of property to burning at the stake, sometimes in mass executions called auto da fe. Whole families were erased from civic life. Wealthy conversos, many of them bankers, physicians, and scholars, were destroyed, their fortunes absorbed by the crown. The obsession with limpieza de sangre would outlive the formal powers of the Inquisition. For centuries, Spanish universities, guilds, and church offices required proof of clean blood for entry. The stain of ancestry became a civic disability. And the logic spread. In colonial Latin America, similar systems were applied to indigenous people and Africans, codifying a racial caste system rooted in religious purity. What began as a tribunal to root out heresy had become a racialized bureaucracy of suspicion. Faith and blood were fused, and guilt could be found in one's family tree. In its fixation on origin, the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, gave birth to a deadly modern idea that who you are is more dangerous than what you believe. Heresy, in the opinion of the Spanish Inquisition, can be inherited. The Spanish Inquisition perfected the techniques of institutionalized fear. It also established central archives, standardized procedures. They needed to follow the genealogy of everyone after all. So we could actually say that they worked a lot to produce procedures that are basis of modern states today. Going back to the indigenous people of the New World, in 1507 the office of Inquisitor General passed to Cardinal Francisco Jiménez de Cisneros, a man as zealous in religious reform as he was in forced conversions. And under his leadership, the Inquisition truly reached over the Atlantic and into the Americas. Initially, indigenous people were exempt from inquisitorial trials due to their recent conversion. Eventually, they fell under suspicion for the same practices that the missionaries had brought with them. The idea of syncretism. Now, syncretism isn't nothing new. It's not something that was invented in colonial times. We find syncretism in the Merovingians, in the first Franks. We find syncretism in almost all of the barbarian people that became Christian after the fall of the Roman Empire or right before it. Syncretism means finding common ground between your previous religion and your new one. And so you have Viking raider Jesus in statues produced by the Franks. And in the New World, this practice was heavily used to make Jesus and Christianity more acceptable to the local population. The Inquisition arrived in New Spain, Mexico, and Peru. setting up tribunals that would operate into the 19th century. Women, too, became targets, especially those accused of superstition and unorthodox spirituality. In a Spain struggling with famine, plague, and war, the Inquisition offered clarity, a simple narrative of enemies within. It has to be said that while this was less true in Spain and will be a lot more true in Italy and other places as we will see now, the Inquisition weirdly could also be a strong ally to women. Inquisitorial tribunals were often used to denounce spouses that had abandoned their family. While not being heresy per se, the union of marriage was still sacred, and so those who went out of it should be punished. Now, this didn't mean that the Inquisition would bring back the husbands. This was often impossible, they had disappeared. But it meant that it allowed women special statuses in order to continue their lives alone or with their family. There are even inquisitorial records of the first child support, you could say. When a husband already had another life, he had escaped his responsibilities, the Inquisition, if they found him, would take money from him, resources, and provide, at least for a time, for the family he had abandoned. Even today, in places like the Archivio Histórico Nacional in Madrid, you can find traces of all of these activities, from the darker to the almost comical to the even positive effects. Now, the Spanish Inquisition was in effect the world's first totalitarian surveillance state. It pioneered techniques of population control through documentation, psychological pressure, and ritualized terror that would be used in modern times in ways we absolutely can recognize without me citing them. Even the papacy, alarmed by its excesses, tried to rein it in. Sixtus IV complained bitterly about its abuses, but Ferdinand ignored him. And so, if Spain does it wrong, maybe Italy can do it right. In 1542, amid the firestorm of the Protestant Reformation, Pope Paul III established the Congregation of the Holy Office of the Inquisition, better known as the Roman Inquisition. Unlike its Spanish counterpart, this Inquisition was a direct instrument of the papacy, designated not to serve a nation, but to defend the universal authority of the Church. Luther's thesis had ignited rebellion. Calvin's theology was spreading like wildfire. Printing presses churned out dangerous ideas by the thousands. Europe was fracturing, and Rome's answer was centralization. The Roman Inquisition did not rely on fire and spectacle as the Spanish Inquisition did. It moved quietly, precisely, and above all, intellectually. Its mission was not just to punish heresy, but to detect and define it. It construct the very boundaries of orthodoxy in the age of print and reason. At the head of the organization sat a panel of cardinals, the Sacred Congregation, answerable only to the Pope. It wielded enormous power, able to summon suspects, censor books, and enforce doctrinal uniformity. Its influence was strongest in Italy, but it extended across Catholic Europe. Perhaps the most famous victim of the Roman Inquisition was Giordano Bruno, a former Dominican friar, ironic considering the Dominican involvement in the beginning of the Inquisition, who turned philosopher. Bruno was spreading dangerous ideas. He thought the universe was infinite. He rejected transubstantiation, all beliefs that were more than heretic. They were corrosive of the Catholic cosmology. After 8 years of interrogation, he was condemned and burned alive in the year 1600 in Campo dei Fiori in Rome. It has to be said that the Roman Inquisition really didn't want to burn Giordano Bruno. That's why the interrogation took 8 years. They wanted him to recant his testimony. They wanted him to turn back. While the burnings in Spain were created by the Inquisition to show everyone their power, to create a spectacle of faith and punishment, the burning of Giordano Bruno was a defeat. By being burnt at the stake, Giordano made his ideas immortal. He made himself a new kind of martyr, just like the ones of the beginning of Christianity. And it's not like the contemporary Inquisition members weren't aware of that. It's just that, well, in a certain sense, he didn't leave them any choice. They couldn't just let him go after 8 years of interrogation. Bruno's trials records are meticulous. The charges against him reveal the Inquisition's broader anxieties. They feared metaphysical contagion, ideas that could unmake reality in a certain sense. Then came Galileo Galilei, whose telescopic observations confirmed the Copernican model. Initially praised by church officials, Galileo's growing confidence and his 1632 publication Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems alarmed the Roman Inquisition. Though he framed his argument as a dialogue, the position of the Copernican advocate was unmistakably sympathetic. Galileo was summoned in 1633 under threat of torture. He recounted, whispering, perhaps apocryphally, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. He was sentenced to house arrest for life. The Inquisition banned his work and forbade the teaching of heliocentrism as a fact. This is what they wanted to do, more or less, to Giordano Bruno. So in all of this, the Roman Inquisition was fighting a war between revelation and observation, between doctrinal control and accelerating the freedom of thought of the scientists. The Inquisition's goal wasn't just to silence Galileo, it was to preserve a cosmological order grounded in theology. Beyond the courts, the Roman Inquisition's reach extended into everyday life through book censorship. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. It grew rapidly after 1559. It banned everything from Protestant theology to Renaissance poetry, political theory, and vernacular Bibles. Even works by devout Catholics, like Erasmus from Rotterdam, found themselves condemned. Printers across Europe were required to submit works for approval. Booksellers had their inventories inspected and needed the imprimatur to print. The imprimatur was a seal that was applied by the Inquisition to the book, marking it as safe for consumption and production. Even opera books, libretti, the little books that contain the story of an opera, were subjected to imprimatur. The Roman Inquisition, of course, also targeted mysticism, especially among women. One notable case is Giulia di Marco, a laywoman from Naples who claimed to receive divine visions and attracted powerful followers. She was arrested in 1598 and interrogated for nearly a decade. Though she avoided execution, she was ultimately condemned and her movement extinguished. Throughout all of this, the Roman Inquisition refined a pattern. It avoided mass executions and preferred public humiliation, exile, or, even more, silence. Its power was not in killing, but in suppressing without drawing attention. It was a subtle organization made of intellectuals who understood the consequences of what was happening and tried to hold the line, we could say, for Catholic orthodoxy. But moving back into definitely mass executions, we will now march north, out of the orthodoxy of Catholic Europe, in another storm that brewed in Germany and other Protestants, not all Protestant, but many of the Protestant countries. One that would consume tens of thousands, mostly women, in one of the most violent outbursts of moral panic in European history, the witch hunts. It has to be specified that most of the witch hunts, and with most I mean an overwhelming majority, wasn't perpetuated by the Inquisition. But right now, as a concept, witch hunts are often put side by side with the Inquisition, so I think it's worth for us to take a look at it. Between the 15th and 18th century, over 50,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. And though inquisitorial courts sometimes participated, particularly in early modern Italy and Spain, the epicenter of violence lay elsewhere, In Germany, Switzerland, Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Protestant and Catholic borderlands of Central Europe. The irony is sharp. While the word Inquisition conjures images of witches on pyres, the Roman and Spanish Inquisition were often skeptical of witchcraft claims. In contrast, secular courts and local religious judges in Northern Europe were far more likely to pursue and execute alleged witches, often in brutal and frenzied ways. In this difference, we find the origin of the Inquisition again. The Inquisition existed because it was independent. The idea was to have independent judges detached from the local situation. When you have a judge that lives near the hypothetical witch, he is often afraid. For his children, for himself, he is taken by the same madness as everyone else. That is why an inquisitor was considered to be better. But you couldn't always have an inquisitor. Let us first add ideological fuel to the pyre. In 1487, two Dominican inquisitors, Dominican again, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Though technically rejected by the Inquisition and many theologians, the book became wildly popular, especially in German-speaking lands. It argued that witches, mostly women, were agents of the devil, who made pacts through sex, attended Sabbaths, killed children, and sowed storms. The Malleus is certainly a sensationalistic book, but it's hard to put every blame on the Malleus itself. It only represented anxieties that existed in society. The witch represented the inversion of what was thought women should be. Mothers and saints, in certain sense, mothers and virgins. So inverting it made them, of course, sexually extreme and ready to sacrifice their own and other people's children mercilessly. The audience of the Malleus was lay judges, magistrates, and Protestant preachers. These were the ones who took the hammer to heart. Between 1560 and 1660, the Holy Roman Empire experienced some of the worst witch panics in history. In Würzburg, over 900 people were executed in a single decade, including children, clergy, and even nobility. In Bamberg, the witch bishop, Johann Georg II, oversaw mass burnings and even built a torture chamber called the Drudenhaus. Far away in Scotland, King James VI, later James I of England, personally obsessed with witchcraft, authorized torture and trials that led to hundreds of executions, many of them poor, illiterate women accused by their neighbors. These hunts were fueled by local anxieties. The role of women, as we said, was important, but there also was failed harvests, plagues, war, and the social chaos unleashed by the Reformation. In regions where Protestant and Catholic forces clashed, witch trials were often a form of spiritual cleansing, a way to prove religious zeal and divine favor. Paranoia became a public ritual. We are, after all, looking at an age where people had turned their back to the ancient ways, the Catholic Church. The war between the Protestants and the Catholics, the clash, we could say more than war, was about souls, salvation. It was personal to every single person involved in it. So while witch trials cannot of course be justified, it is understandable how people at the time were full of a level of anxiety about their immortal soul, their eternity, terrified of taking the wrong choice or to be led astray. Since, after all, someone was. Someone was being led astray. Half of Europe was Catholic, half of Europe was Protestant, half of Europe was doomed. And so, of course, you can imagine how this translates to the devil or the witch trying to get your soul. Because, in reality, in their way of looking at the world, of course, someone truly was. The Inquisition, by contrast, downplayed witchcraft often, especially by the 17th century. In Spain, for example, the inquisitors at Logrono, pardon my pronunciation, investigated a mass panic in the Basque region in 1609. Out of thousands of accusations, only a dozen were condemned, and even these sentences were cautious. One inquisitor, Alonso de Salazar, wrote after the trials, "There were neither witches nor bewitched until they were talked about." This rational skepticism set the Inquisition apart. The institution was brutal, yes, but it was also centralized, legalistic, and ultimately concerned with heresy, not magic. Witchcraft, in its folk and demonic forms, was marginal to its mission, something that peasants would think about, not intellectuals. The great witch hunts of Northern Europe were not inquisitorial phenomena. They were the product of fractured states, local courts, and a desperate need for scapegoats in a world breaking apart. But it has to be said that they of course took from the playbook of inquisitors. The authors of the Malleus were inquisitors after all. So, in a way, there is an influence of Inquisition into the activity of non-inquisitors. And yet, in a strange way, if those regions had the Inquisition, they would have probably had less death. By the 18th century, the Roman Inquisition no longer commanded the same terror it had in Bruno's or Galileo's time. But that didn't mean it was gone. It had simply settled into the bloodstream of the church, becoming more bureaucratic than theatrical, more clerical than spectacular. This era was marked by paradox. The Enlightenment challenged the religious authority, yet the Inquisition tightened its internal controls. Public burnings and high-profile trials waned, but a new mode of enforcement emerged, one that emphasized doctrinal orthodoxy over public punishment. In 1758, Cardinal Carlo Rezzonico, later Pope Clement XIII, presided over a congregation that still censored books, issued theological rulings, and persecuted clergy for deviating from church teachings. But the larger drama was unfolding outside of Rome. The Enlightenment had changed the playing field. Philosophers, like Voltaire and Diderot, openly mocked the Inquisition. Voltaire's Candide features a brutal satire of the auto da fe. Criticism of inquisitorial methods became part of broader Enlightenment ideology. Reason against superstition, liberty against tyranny. In Catholic countries, kings began to push back. The Portuguese Inquisition was curbed under the Marquis of Pombal. In Spain, Charles III expelled the Jesuits and gradually reduced inquisitorial power. Even in Rome, reformist cardinals began to see the Inquisition as an embarrassment to modern statecraft. And yet, the congregation endured. Its secret archives swelled with cases, many involving now internal church discipline. Priests accused of Jansenism, mysticism, or sexual misconduct faced its tribunals. So did laity spreading heretical texts or attending unauthorized spiritual gatherings. One striking case is that of Francesco Antonio Zaccaria, a Jesuit historian and theologian, censored multiple times by the Inquisition in the mid-18th century for defending controversial theological positions and publishing without prior approval, the famous imprimatur. His career became a cautionary tale of intellectual ambition colliding with institutional scrutiny. The Inquisition also played a role in managing internal dissent and mystical enthusiasm. The 1770s saw investigations into various visionaries, including Maria Francesca delle Cinque Piaghe, so Maria Francesca of the Five Plagues, whose extreme asceticism and claims of divine intimacy drew suspicion. She was never condemned, but her followers were warned, monitored, and gradually marginalized. The silencing strategy that the Roman Inquisition was already known for had evolved and now acted completely in the shadows. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Rome and briefly abolished the Inquisition. He looted its archives and ridiculed its functionaries. But with the fall of Napoleon, the congregation was restored in 1814 by Pope Pius VII. Its offices, procedures, and mission largely intact. This continuity, even after revolutionary disruption, speaks volumes about his ability to endure. By now, the Inquisition was no longer about rooting out heresy among the masses. It had become a guardian of theological boundaries within the Church itself. It had morphed, changed. It published decrees, investigated clergy, and maintained the Index of Forbidden Books, which was still in full effect. The 19th century, however, brought new enemies, especially one: liberal Catholicism. Doesn't sound that threatening, right? The push for national unification also was a problem, especially in Italy. The increasing independence of European states threatened papal authority. The congregation reacted with caution, but was determined to fight. In 1854, Pope Pius IX declared the Immaculate Conception of Mary a dogma. It was a bold assertion of papal authority in an era of waning temporal power. Behind this decision stood doctrinal gatekeepers, including members of the Inquisition, ensuring theological compliance across seminaries and pulpits. Pius IX would later preside over the First Vatican Council between 1879 and 1870, which defined the dogma of papal infallibility. Once again, the congregation played a crucial backstage role, reviewing theological submissions and shaping the intellectual framework of the council. They were the hand behind the action of the popes, and the ones who would ensure that the priests on the ground wouldn't fly off the handle. Then came the final blow to the temporal power of the pope. In 1870, the Kingdom of Italy seized Rome. The papal states fell. The Pope declared himself a prisoner in the Vatican. The Inquisition, now without the arm of the state to enforce its ruling, appeared completely obsolete. And yet, it remained quiet and unyielding. Because the real shift had already occurred. The Inquisition had moved inward. No longer needed auto da fe or public trials. It had become a curial core of ideological enforcement. A watchdog of orthodoxy buried deep into the machinery of the Catholic Church. It burned people with whispers, not matches. Its name was still the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, but soon it would be known simply as the Holy Office. It was under Pope Leo XIII that the Holy Office began confronting new threats at the end of the 19th century. Not Protestantism or heresy, not even mysticism or doctrinal liberties taken by liberal Catholics, but modernism, a movement among Catholic scholars that sought to reconcile church doctrine with modern philosophy, science, and historical criticism. The defining moment came under Pope Pius X, who in 1907 issued Lamentabili Sane Exitu, and the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, which collectively condemned modernism as the synthesis of all heresies. The Holy Office enforced this campaign. Every priest and theologian was required to take an oath against modernism. Seminaries were purged, suspect books were banned or corrected. One high-profile case was that of George Tyrrell, an English Jesuit and modernist theologian. He was expelled from the Jesuits in 1906 and excommunicated in 1908. Denied a Catholic burial, his body was interred in a civil cemetery. His crime? Attempting to reconcile Catholic doctrine with historical biblical criticism and democratic politics. The Holy Office now preferred this quieter, non-lethal marginalization. A theologian might be silenced, reassigned, or excommunicated, but not tried in public. The age of bonfires was over, but the age of violence had just begun. In the 1920s and 30s, fascism rose across Europe, and the Holy Office largely avoided confrontation with totalitarian regimes. Instead, it focused on internal threats. Under Pius XII, in his Holy Office, led by the conservative Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, a tight leash on theological innovation was kept, especially in the wake of World War II. Ottaviani was a symbol of silent orthodoxy. His office scrutinized theologians like Henri de Lubac, Yves Congar, and Teilhard de Chardin, all of whom would later be vindicated. Their writings were placed under suspicion or banned outright. Their careers stalled, their ideas seen as dangerous. Even in the 1950s, the Holy Office maintained the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. It included works by Victor Hugo, Descartes, Sartre, and modern Catholics alike. Though increasingly out of step with the world, the index signaled that the Church still claimed the right to curate the boundaries of reality. And then, in 1958, came Pope John XXIII. In his eyes, this revolutionary pope saw that the Church had become too insular, too suspicious, too afraid. In 1962, he convened the Second Vatican Council, calling for aggiornamento, bringing the Church up to date. Inside the Vatican, this turned into a war. Ottaviani, still prefect of the Holy Office, resisted every step of reform. He tried to veto liberal voices against the Pope. He warned against change, but even with the battle raging, the council rolled on, led by voices he had once tried to silence: de Lubac, Congar, Rachner. In 1965, as the Vatican II concluded, Pope Paul VI took a dramatic step. He restructured the Holy Office, renaming it the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, CDF. The term Inquisition was finally completely retired, not out of repentance, but as a part of a PR strategy. Ottaviani stayed on after all, but his influence was fading. The name had changed, the building stayed, the mission endured. In 1981, Pope John Paul II appointed a brilliant but polarizing German theologian to lead the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, a former liberal turned staunch conservative. Ratzinger would serve as prefect of the CDF for 24 years, longer than any man since the era of the Roman Inquisition. The press dubbed him the Panzer Cardinal and God's Rottweiler. He did not object. In his view, the Church was under siege, not by witches or heretics, but by moral relativism, liberation theology, feminism, and postmodern confusion. Under his leadership, the CDF reasserted itself as guardian of the orthodoxy. It was no longer burning heretics, it was absolutely silencing them. Not a new tactic, but a reaffirmed one in a very modern era. One of the first major confrontations was with liberation theology, a movement born in Latin America that emphasized Jesus as a liberator of the poor and advocated for social and sometimes revolutionary action. In 1984 and 1986, the CDF published two critical instructions, condemning key aspects of liberation theology as dangerously close to Marxism. Ratzinger personally oversaw disciplinary action against major figures. Let's take two examples. One is Leonardo Boff, a Brazilian Franciscan, silenced in 1985 for his book Church, Charism and Power. When Boff was ordered not to speak or publish, he described the experience as a white martyrdom. Another was Gustavo Gutierrez, the Peruvian priest who coined the term liberation theology. He was never formally condemned, but his work was aggressively scrutinized, and his influence stifled within the official church structures. Ratzinger's CDF also targeted feminist theologians like Sister Margaret Farley, whose book, Just Love, would later be condemned in 2012. It was Ratzinger himself who condemned it after becoming pope for its views on same-sex relationships and sexual ethics. At the turn of the millennium, the congregation released Dominus Lesus, a declaration stating that salvation exists only through the Catholic Church and that Protestant and Orthodox communities were defective. The language caused outrage worldwide, but it was a reassertion of inquisitorial clarity. The boundaries of truth must be firm, even if they offend. Ratzinger also pushed against internal dissent in the West. When German bishops attempted to liberalize church teachings on contraception and marriage counseling in the 90s, the CDF intervened. Theologians in the US who challenged the church ban on contraception or homosexuality, like Charles Curran, were stripped of their right to teach Catholic theology. Throughout, Ratzinger emphasized a key shift. The Inquisition no longer required state power. In the global church of the 21st century, reputational damage, theological censor, and clerical isolation were the new weapons. But the CDF, of course, also maintained an internal tribunal system, investigating clergy not just for doctrinal error, but for misconduct, including sexual abuse. But even here, the institutions showed the limits of its reforms. Critics accused the CDF of prioritizing secrecy over justice, something we have heard a lot about, protecting the church image rather than the victims. By the early 2000s, the press was drawing direct lines between inquisitorial secrecy and abuse cover-ups. The habit of internal handling, of punishing scandals instead of sins, had root centuries deep. When Ratzinger became Pope Benedict XVI in 2005, he brought the CDF perspective to the papacy itself. His reign was marked by both continuity and crisis. He upheld orthodoxy, continued cracking down on dissent, but struggled to control the growing tidal wave of abuse revelation. In 2013, Benedict XVI made history by resigning from the papacy, the first pope to do so in nearly 600 years. Some observers saw this not as weakness, but as the logical end of an era. The Inquisition had survived, but the old guard could not outpace modern transparency. Still, his legacy as the final Inquisitor Pope remains powerful. For decades, Ratzinger's CDF acted as true doctrinal engine of the Church, shaping everything from interfaith dialogue to moral theology. And while the world around it changed, while cathedrals emptied and digital culture surged, the Inquisition never truly stepped back. And so it was time for the next act. In 2022, Pope Francis renamed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, turning it into the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, DDF. A shift that might be bureaucratic, but marked the final absorption of the Inquisition into the modern papal administration. Behind the new name, the same old institution remains, but it is now more, let's say, under control instead of in control. It is still housed in the same 16th century palazzo where Galileo was condemned. The DDF still fulfills the core inquisitorial task, defining what Catholics are permitted to believe, teach, and practice. Today, it works in two distinct sections. The disciplinary section, which handles cases of clerical abuse, misconduct, and laicizations, and the doctrinal section, which oversees theology, interfaith dialogue, and ecclesial unity. So, even if more abuses cases are heard by the DDF these days, inquisitorial legacy continues to manifest. In 2023, in a very Roman Inquisition decision, the DDF confirmed that transgender people could, under certain conditions, be baptized or serve as godparents, so long as no public scandal was caused. There is the Roman Inquisition. This is the Inquisition of silence, the Inquisition Ratzinger led, that still bears his fangs. Some level of reform has been attempted under Pope Francis. In 2023, he appointed Archbishop Victor Manuel Fernandez as the new prefect of the DDF, known as a personal ally of the Pope and more progressive as a theologian than most. Fernandez signaled a change in tone. His mission, according to Francis, was to promote theological knowledge, not just condemn errors. This echoed the Vatican II's shift from an inquisitorial posture to a missionary one. But critics pointed out that the DDF still exists. It still investigates theologians, it still shapes global Catholic orthodoxy, it may smile, but it carries a red pen, and so it still exists today. I hope you enjoyed this little inquisitorial history, and I do hope to see you in the comments and on my next video. Have a good one.